Hello and welcome to another edition of Adam's Music Box, where today marks the very tragic death of Stevie Ray Vaughan from a helicopter crash in 1990. But while the really tragic way that he died at such a young age will always be remembered, I think and hope what will be remembered more is the fact that he really did something not only virtuosic, but very unique with the guitar. And the reason I say this is because he came to prominence in the 1980s, and the 1980s wasn't an era that we typically associate with blues guitar. We associate it with melodic rock guitar, with heavy metal, with shredding. It was a decade that was owned by Eddie Van Halen. It was the decade that the world got to know who Yngwie Malmsteen is. It was the decade when the hair was big, the guitar solos were loud, had a lot of reverb, and it was really a time where the guitar was really more about rock than any other genre. But there was under the surface a blues resurgence that led to several artists selling a lot of records. And we can ask ourselves why this might be. Well, at the very tail end of the 70s and at the beginning of the 80s, the Blues Brothers were very famous. These characters that were invented by Dan Aykroyd and his friend John Belushi, and it obviously evolved into something much bigger than just characters because they formed a band with great musicians, including members of Booker T and the MGs, recorded albums, went on the road. Belushi became a pretty damn good vocalist, and Dan Aykroyd was pretty damn good at the harmonica. So it went from the life of a fiction to something real. And even though a lot of the music they played was actually more sort of R&B and soul derived than strict blues, it got the concept of blues back on people's minds for the first time in a while. I mean, there's a great film of the Watt-Stax concert at the LA Coliseum from 1971, a celebration of civil rights and of the music of Stax Records, the soul and R&B of the day. And one of the men they interviewed from Watts was talking about how blues is something kind of for old people. But it came back in the 80s, and the two men that I credit most were Robert Cray and Stevie Ray Vaughan. And very interestingly, Robert Cray was on stage with Stevie Ray Vaughan and perennial blues rock legend Eric Clapton. Fortunately, they didn't go on that helicopter. I wish, obviously, Stevie had stayed behind. But his virtuosity was something that was immediately noticeable. It was beloved by guitar players and by observers of music, and it was also equally apparent just to the casual listener. His sound was clean, it was loud, it was bold, and it could be fast, it could be slow, but it was always something that was very emotionally valid. It really drew you in as a listener. His writing was great. He really brought blues into the 80s, but without AT-ifying it, if you know what I mean. Most of the production on his albums was relatively timeless. You have a bit of that sort of heavily 80s reverb drum sound on a few of them, but the guitar playing itself is remarkably cleanly recorded, which wasn't really the style in the 80s. So it created that timeless sound. And he's really, in many ways, the lost to the great blues guitarist that everybody knew. Blues as a subgenre will never go away. And the reason is twofold. One, it's a fun genre. Two, it's a storytelling genre. But most importantly, the root of all modern pop music that has been influential in the United States, in much of Europe, in the world, it's been blues music. Blues gave birth to ragtime, which was a popular pop music in the early 20th century. It gave birth to jazz of all different varieties, gave birth to soul and R&B. You could say it gave birth to a lot of modern dance music, which was disco derived, and before that R&B derived, rock and roll. You wouldn't have rock and roll without the blues. And so, being such a lodestone of modern music, it's never going to go away. But in terms of a blues star that everybody knows, Stevie Ray Vaughan was one of the lost, and he was one of the best of all time. He was on television, he sold out big shows. He was a hard-living man who had a lot of fun on the road, but his guitar just really said it all. He looked like the blues. He was an authentic guy. He was doing what he was really grew up around. If he was still alive, I think that he would have continued to have made blues rock albums that would have continued to have musical success. And the reason I say that, even though the 90s killed off a lot of the artists that were not only big in the 80s, but also big in the 70s, the bands that it killed off were bands that were playing music that defined the era, where blues is something that is really perpetual. It never begins and ends. I mean, obviously began somewhere, and we know where, but it's one of those perpetual musics that will never go away. I could well imagine a 1995 or a 2005 Stevie Ray Vaughan album that sold pretty much as well as the stuff he did in the 80s. But alas, that wasn't to happen. Luckily, the stuff that he has put out is fantastic. So here's to Stevie Ray Vaughan. The legacy will continue. Like, subscribe. We will see you next time. Take care.